plan for the session today is that we're going to keep you guys on mute because it's a bit easier for Heather to work through her slides. She's got about an hour-long presentation for us. And what we're going to ask is, for those of you comfortable with Zoom, and hopefully you all are getting sort of comfortable, but there's a chat function, and what we ask is that we're going to do Q&A at the end, so question and answer at the end. Nikki's going to keep an eye on that and monitor that during the session for you. But yeah, any questions, just put them into the chat. I'm more than open to dealing with those. I think it's probably a bit windy, so apologies for that. But I'm going to shush in a minute, and you're not going to have to listen to me out in the garden with the wind blowing around anyway. Yeah, like I say, questions at the end via the chat function. Is everyone okay with that? You can unmute yourselves now. Is everyone okay? Do they want me to run through that? If you just hover at the bottom of your screen, the chat bar will come up, and you'll be able to put questions into the chat bar there. Okay, so who is, and I can't see everyone unfortunately at the minute, but is anyone new to HR Connect today? Is there any newbies? Hands up. Hannah, good to see you. Yeah. Anyone else want to unmute themselves or introduce themselves at all? No, I'll carry on then. That's fine. But yeah, good to see you here today, Hannah. Thanks for joining us. Really, really appreciate you coming along. Just a bit about the group. So our community principles, we're really inclusive, welcome all existing or potential HR and learning and development professionals, whatever their experience levels or specific roles. We're freely giving of all our knowledge and experience at the sessions and in support of each other's personal development too. However, we don't sell. Obviously, this is a bit of an online session anyway, but when we do meet face-to-face at BGL on a monthly basis, we're quite keen that it's a safe environment, that there's no real selling. It's just about building relationships and building our network. We're very informal and create a relaxed and friendly atmosphere. A bit about the committee members. So up in the top left, there's Katie. Katie is Learning and Development Lead at BGL, as well as having her own business, Real Progress too. She normally hosts us at BGL when we're able to meet in person. Eve is from Bonacia, and she is an HR manager there, and she does all of our Eventbrite. She's absolutely awesome. Sadly, neither of those could be with us today, but there is our awesome in-house Nikki Morby from HR Your Business Matters, giving everyone away. Thanks, Nikki. She'll be helping with the Q&A a bit later on. Nikki's an absolute star, and she invited Heather along today. I'm going to say from CCC, because I've already been told off for saying it incorrectly, but I'm pretty sure it's Cambridgeshire Consultancy and Counselling. Thumbs up. Thumbs up, boom, I got it right. Yeah, from I'm not going to say it again, from CCC, and Heather's from there, and CCC are a not-for-profit charitable organisation, and Nikki is a trustee for them, and the purpose for them is that they offer mental health awareness training as well as counselling that's accessible, it's affordable. It doesn't mean that we have to wait for long periods of time on the NHS, but we also don't have to spend lots and lots of money on expensive private counselling as well. So it's a great service, great solution. We're really proud to be able to have Heather here with us today. So I'm not going to keep carrying on. You're here to hear from Heather and not me. So I'm going to pass over to you, Heather. Is everything okay? You happy to go?
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, Pete.
No worries.
I just want to say thank you to everybody for inviting me today and for listening to me. Hopefully you'll find it helpful. I'm just going to talk a bit about CCC and mental health in the workplace and how we help businesses and HR professionals to support people in their teams, and some of the real life scenarios that have come up and the things we put in place to support those businesses. So it is Mental Health Awareness Week, as Peter said. The theme this year is kindness. So I very much hope you'll all be very kind to me, because I haven't done a Zoom webinar before. So hopefully it will all go smoothly, but if suddenly you can't hear me or I have a technical problem, please let Peter know. I just want to say I am not technical, but I'm also not clinical. So if you do have any questions that are of a clinical nature that I can't answer, I will take your details and I will get back to you when I've spoken, or get one of our clinical team to get back to you. But because it is important that you do get the information that you need. Cambridgeshire Consultancy in Counselling, which is a complete mouthful, but it is, so we often just say CCC, is a charitable organisation. We've been going since 1978, so 42 years. And you may or may not have heard of us because we have never had to market ourselves or advertise. We really just keep going through word of mouth and recommendation, usually from one HR manager or occupational health advisor to another, because we really have a reputation for quality. All of our counsellors, and we have over 40 counselling members, and all of them are fully qualified, very experienced people. We all adhere to BACP guidelines, they're all DBS checked, they're all registered with CIO, they do safeguarding training, data protection training. So unlike if you were just to phone a counsellor that you'd Googled from the internet or looked on the counselling directory, you can be sure that you are getting someone who adheres to the BACP Code of Ethics and Guidelines. You also have the ability to change counsellor if, for example, you are working with somebody and you're just not getting on with them. So that's a bit about CCC. I will tell you also that when clients have seen a counsellor for counselling, at their last session, they are given a questionnaire to fill in to rate their experience. And of the people who return those, 99% of clients say that they're satisfied, very satisfied, or completely satisfied with the service they've received. So from our point of view, we are very proud of the quality of service that we provide. So as I said, if we can move on to the next slide, please, Peter. So I'm not technical, so Peter's going to move the slides on for me. Let's talk about mental health. Everybody's talking about mental health. That's the new buzz thing, isn't it? Let's talk, let's talk. And we all have mental health, just as we all have physical health. So when people talk about someone having mental health, and they mean that in a negative context, what they actually mean is that somebody is struggling with their mental health or they have a mental health problem. And mental health, just as physical health, can be good, bad, or somewhere in between. And it can vary from one day to the next. So just as with your physical health, you might be on the whole pretty healthy, but then something happens which upsets the balance and you find that you are less healthy for a period of time, and you can do something to remedy or address that problem or cope with it. Or you might have a longer term ongoing health condition which you need to manage, either by your behaviours or with medication. And it's exactly the same with mental health. It covers a huge array of different problems. And I think sometimes when we talk about mental health, we assume, oh, that means depression. But that's just one of the many things. And the other thing we talk about with mental health is we always assume it's a long-term, lifelong problem. But as I say, it could be just a very short-term situation that you're struggling with. When is poor mental health a problem? Well, we all have down days. We all have days where we get up and we're feeling like we're lacking in energy, or just not feeling it, or we're feeling down, or something's getting on top of us, or we feel overwhelmed. When it becomes a problem is that when it starts to affect your ability to function in everyday life, or when it's ongoing. And in the same way as with physical health, you might put up with a little ache or pain or ailment for a few days or even a couple of weeks. If it persists for several weeks, you would go and see a doctor or some other health professional. And it's exactly the same with mental health. So, you know, if you were feeling down for a couple of days, or if you could attribute it to a certain event which might have triggered you feeling a bit out of sorts, you might not consider it a problem. But if after weeks and weeks you just can't get on top of the situation, then that is something that you need to address. So I often equate it to a headache, really. So if you had a headache, there are many things you can do to address it, some of which are medicinal and some of which are down to behaviour. And quite often that will mean that your headache goes away. So you might drink more water, get more fresh air, take more exercise, learn to stress, learn to de-stress, lay down in a darkened room, or you may take painkillers. There's just many things that you can do to address that problem. But a constant headache for 3 weeks could be as a result of an underlying health condition, and you need to get that checked out. So if we look at what good and poor mental health looks like, on the next slide, please. So when you are mentally healthy, you have the ability to learn, feel, express, and manage a range of positive and negative emotions. As I said, life throws a lot at us, and as human beings, we're fairly resilient. We should have the wherewithal to be able to withstand a certain amount of challenge and a certain amount of stress. And we also have positive stress in our lives. Anyone who's got married will probably know that planning a wedding is quite a stressful time of your life, that it's self-imposed, and it's positive stress. Generally it comes along with excitement, so you should be able to manage that if you are mentally healthy. It also gives you the ability to maintain and form good relationships with other people without constant trauma or conflict, and it gives you the ability to cope and manage change and uncertainty. And goodness me, we're all experiencing quite a lot of that at the moment. So I think we've all had to cope with an awful lot of change, and I think most people will have taken most things in their stride. When everything comes at once, it can be more challenging, and it's almost like filling up a glass full of water, and you can cope with a little bit and a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. But if everything comes at you at once, the glass becomes full and it starts to tip over. It doesn't mean you have a lifelong mental health problem. It probably just means there's too much at once, and that's quite normal. If you are experiencing poor mental health, you could be feeling overwhelmed, isolated. Gosh, I bet a lot of people are feeling isolated at the moment. Constantly feeling irritable or upset if you're not able to manage your emotions or control them. You may have a change in energy levels, be constantly lethargic, or you may compulsively eat and comfort eat and eat all the things that you shouldn't really be eating or drink. Or it may be that you just can't face eating at all. You're likely to have a reduction in concentration, and that's when particularly it starts to affect people's performance at work. And again, if you're having difficulty sleeping, that will have a negative impact on your ability to cope with the day and your resilience. And you will probably be struggling to cope with positive or negative change. So we as an organisation have seen an increased number of people contacting us because of the current situation. There are those who have a lot of anxiety generally about their health, their jobs. Interestingly enough, furlough, I think people assume that, oh, it must be lovely to be on a furlough for a couple of weeks and just sit in the garden and enjoy the sunshine. But it's important to realise that that can also bring quite a lot of anxieties with it for the people who are furloughed, especially if there isn't a lot of consultation within that process. So we have seen reports of people who are starting to question how valued they are within the organisation, and whether they'll be needed, and whether they'll have a job to go to when they go back. And those are things that we need to be very mindful of if we do have staff that we're dealing with who are on furlough and are probably having challenges with their mental health right now. So the most common mental health issues that we see at CCC are definitely stress, anxiety and depression, overwhelmingly. I wouldn't like to put a percentage on it because obviously it's a variable figure, but all of our counsellors deal with all of those things. And Peter mentioned that one of the benefits of CCC is the speed at which somebody can be referred and seen. So if you were to refer to yourself to the GP, in Peterborough at the moment, in certain areas, you can wait 16 weeks for a referral for counselling. And obviously in that time, somebody's condition can get very much worse, and it's not ideal. So at the moment in Peterborough, if you were to call today, we could set you up with a counsellor within a couple of days. And that early intervention is absolutely key to managing people's mental health and making sure that they don't start going down that downward spiral, because once you're in that descent, it's much more difficult to get people up and out again and back into work and functioning normally. So stress, anxiety and depression are the most common mental health issues. We also see people with mild eating disorders, and you can include in that other addictions. We also have obsessive compulsive disorder, personality disorder, bipolar and schizophrenia. As we go down that list, they become very much more difficult to manage and much more serious. And really anything from a moderate eating disorder, you should be seeking professional help for any of those things. There are things you can do to self-manage for low-level mental health conditions, but as soon as they start to become more serious, then they definitely have to be referred to a health professional. Not necessarily CCC, there is a first responders service with the NHS, though they are very overwhelmed. And there are also other charities which provide similar services. If you are looking at schizophrenia and usually bipolar, you are probably looking at medicating for your illness. So what about mental health at work? If we look on the next slide, why does it matter? Oh, sorry, I didn't ask you to move on. If we can go on to the next one, thanks. Why does it matter to organisations? Why should you even be bothered about mental health? Well, it has a huge impact on absence from work, and that is obviously very costly to organisations in terms of paying people for being off sick, but also the pressure it puts on others to backfill somebody's workload. Perhaps you have to redistribute workload out to other people, and quite often a long-term illness will result in people leaving, so then you've got recruitment and induction costs as well. The Health and Safety Executive estimated that 28.2 million working days were lost between 2018 to 19 because of work-related stress, depression or anxiety, the big three. And you can see how much that's increased just in a 2-year period, more than doubled. So it is on the up. And one of the reasons for that, they suggest, is that ever more pressure on people to improve efficiency at work means that the people who are in work are under a lot more stress and have an increased workload. So I'm sure that you're probably all aware of this as HR professionals, but it is important that we sometimes push back from any overzealous campaigns to increase productivity, which actually might backfire in the longer term, because you might get a small amount more work out of each person, but ultimately people can generally sustain that in the short term, but in the much longer term it does start to have an impact on their mental health. And that's why really every organisation should have some kind of strategy to look at and manage mental health issues at work and make sure they are keeping an eye on what's going on within their organisation. So if we look at the next slide, the main causes of workplace stress, obviously nearly half of that people report is workload. So that really underlines what we've just been saying. It's really disappointing, actually. These are from the Health and Safety Executive, these stats, and they haven't produced anything since 2011-12. So it's very difficult to compare like with like. They have produced other statistics about workplace stress, but you can't really compare what the main causes are. So at the moment we're going on this kind of data, but I think it's still true, because I think we are still all looking at the pennies, we're all still looking at the bottom line, and organisations are under pressure to get as much out of their resources as they can. If we look at the next slide, it's important, or it's interesting to note that workplace size is also important, and generally the larger the organisation, the more likely your staff are to experience mental health issues. And this is really, it could be down to a number of factors. In general, if you're in a smaller organisation, you're much likely to have responsibility for a greater number of things. So your workload is likely to be much more varied, and you are much more likely to feel that you have a greater contribution at top level. Whereas if you're a very small cog in a very big machine, firstly, you're more likely to struggle with feeling needed and valued and all the rest of it. And organisations have to work very, very hard to make sure that everyone in their teams does feel valued. But also it's it's sometimes easier to hide in a large organisation. So if you take time off sick, you know there are probably 3 other people in your team who can cover your workload. Whereas if you are one person doing one function, and you know if you take time off sick, when you go back, it's all just going to stacked up and be waiting for you. I think you're much less likely to take time off work. So it's interesting that we work with a full range of sizes of organisation, but we do see most referrals from larger organisations. So this does back up, or our experience backs up this research. We even have some organisations where we go in, we send a counsellor in on site, obviously not at the moment because we're not able to do face-to-face counselling at the moment. So all of our counselling during the lockdown period is provided as either telephone or video link support. But ordinarily we have organisations where we send a counsellor in on site and they work for a whole day once a week. So you can imagine that's quite prevalent, people struggling. So I thought I'd do a little quiz. If we move on to the next slide, I'm sure many of you will know the answer to this question. Sorry, if we can move on, please. Thank you. So it's just something for you to consider. I'm not expecting anyone to shout out or answer these questions. Just have a little think and decide which answer you think is correct, and then just think about the impact of that. So how many people in the UK will experience a mental health problem every year? And these figures are from change.org. The answer, which is on the next slide, is 1 in 4. 1 in 4, if you think about just this group of people here, that means that statistically, there will be people in this conversation today who are actually struggling a little bit. And if you think about your teams that you work with in your HR roles, and think about the individuals that you know, that's quite a shocking statistic, really. So on the next slide, we've got another question. What proportion of people with mental health problems say they experience stigma? 10%, 50%, or 90%? What do we think? The answer is actually, on the next slide, 90%. So whether that is the case or not, the fact that people feel that they will be stigmatized for admitting that they've got a mental health challenge is very important, because that is going to prevent them from coming forward and talking to people about what they're struggling with. And on the next slide, how many people will experience suicidal thoughts throughout their lifetime? 2%, even 2% is quite a high number if you think about that. 17% or 33%? And the answer is 17%. So that's actually just under 1 in 6, 1 in 7, something like that. That again is a lot of people. So it doesn't mean that they will constantly feel suicidal, and we'll talk about suicide a little bit more going for later on in the presentation. But to think that that many people have considered taking their own lives is quite shocking, I think. And what proportion of people with mental health problems believe that workplace stress contributed to their illness? 1 in 5, 1 in 3, 2 in 3? Well, we had a little bit of a clue about this earlier. So it's actually 2 in 3 people. And again, whether that is the real cause of their stress or not, it kind of doesn't matter, because if they perceive that their workplace is causing them stress, then they are likely to kick back against the organisation if they feel unsupported by that organisation. And it's interesting to note that of the people that we see from our clients, we have one client that gives a different number of sessions. They allocate a different number of sessions for each referral, depending on whether that person's problem is a personal problem or a work-related problem. So lots of people come through saying, oh yes, it's a work-related problem, probably because they get more sessions paid for them. But I think their perception is it's a work-related problem, and it's very easy to feel stressed by things that are going on at work. But it's a bit like that glass I talked about earlier of filling up and filling up and filling up. And it may just be that the workplace situation has tipped them over the edge and caused that glass to overflow. But actually there was a surface level of home stress and personal stress bubbling under the surface for quite a long time. And when they actually come to counselling, they come initially wanting to talk about the workplace problem, but the more their issues are explored with the counsellor, we actually find that there are a number of underlying problems that need to be addressed, because the base level of what they're dealing with is too high on an ongoing basis. So lots of small things will tip them over the edge. So on the next slide, we pose the question, how long do the majority of people with a mental health problem suffer before telling even their closest family and friends about it? 2 months, 7 months, or over 1 year? If you think about if you were struggling with a physical problem, how long would you tolerate it before you actually went to the GP or moaned to your spouse or talked to your parent or child about what was going on? I think generally not very long, but actually with mental health, people say on the next slide that they struggle for over a year before they even tell anybody about it. So if you think there are a lot of people out there just managing and covering up and coping and looking like they're coping, when actually under the surface, they're really struggling with what's going on. So let's talk about that stigma, because clearly that is preventing people from telling people about their mental health challenges. And particularly in the workplace, I think no matter how much we make it okay and we promote a culture of openness and honesty, and we encourage people to come forward and talk about mental health in the workplace, there will always be the perception that if somebody goes to an HR team or a line manager and admits to having a mental health problem, I think people often think that it will go against them when things are being considered for things like promotions or redundancies, and they think that they will be discriminated against negatively. Whatever legislation is in place, you can't argue with how people perceive the way things are. So stigma is important, and one of the things that is important about reducing that stigma is the way we talk about mental health. So what words do we use when we talk about mental health? And maybe if you just think back to some of the conversations you've had, perhaps when you've been talking about a member of staff who's struggling, or perhaps you've had an incident at work, and perhaps think about some of the things their colleagues have said about them. And it can quite often be quite derogatory, and some of the language we use, we don't really think about it. And we talk quite flippantly about things being mental or crazy, or I'll refrain from using any bad language, but you know, messed up. So we need to just be careful to talk about mental health in a way which doesn't make people feel worse about themselves than they ordinarily do. And language is important. And if you tell somebody all the time that they are worthless and they're not as good, they are going to start to believe that. And it's really important that if people are perhaps struggling with self-esteem or struggling with anxiety or perhaps have imposter syndrome, that they are, we talk about them in a way which is bolstering and which makes them feel that it's okay and that they are valued and they are worthwhile. How do the words we use affect us and those around us? So this is what I said earlier, really. People have the impression that they will be discriminated against if they talk about mental health or if they admit to having a mental health problem. It probably isn't the case, but in terms of this, perception is reality. And if somebody feels that way, then it will stop them coming forward. And then if we think about how does the media portray mental health, this is an interesting one because in CCC's 42 years, the situation has changed hugely. And when CCC first started providing counselling services, it was really perceived to be this hairy-fairy, very American, oh, let's all get a therapist kind of new wave movement, and not very widely accepted. But there has been a lot of change over that time, and particularly in the last 5 to 10 years, where a lot of celebrities have started to come out, if you like, and admit that and talk about the problems that they've experienced. I think some of the first ones to do so were people like Stephen Fry, Ruby Wax, comedians, and people at that time were thinking, a comedian, how can a comedian have depression or bipolar disorder? It was a bit incongruous. And I think as we are learning, and we're all as a society coming to understand that you can be a comedian and have depression, and the two things can sit together and you can live with those things. The media has also changed the way that they report mental health. If there were ever any unfortunate incidents like mass shootings, particularly stateside, quite often the first thing that the media would say is perhaps they had a mental health problem, and that really gives a very negative connotation, because people perhaps who then work with someone who has a mental health problem start to assume, oh, actually this person could be dangerous, when in reality very, very few people who have a mental health problem will ever do anything to harm anyone else. And I think things are getting better, and they continue to get better, and campaigns like Mental Health Awareness Week are really having a huge impact on that. I think whether you're a royalist or not, somebody who is as privileged as Prince Harry coming out and saying that he has struggled with his mental health has made it much more acceptable for a lot of people who perhaps were not open to the idea that it can affect anybody, and not open to the idea that counselling can help. So things are changing, which is good. So if we look at the statistics, I think it's widely accepted, or people always say, oh yes, most people who commit suicide are middle-aged men. And that is true. In England, women are more likely to report, and that's an interesting and key word, are more likely to report a common mental health problem, and almost twice as likely to be diagnosed with anxiety. But I think the very fact that many more men commit suicide, take their own lives than women, is indicative of the fact that perhaps there is less disparity than we think about the number of people who are suffering. And culturally and traditionally, and it is a massive gender stereotype, but it has been that women tend to have more support networks with whom they're more likely to be able to discuss their feelings and their problems and share. And men, although they do have support networks, very often for a particular demographic of men, they're likely to get together with people who share an interest or a hobby, and they might get together and talk about the football or their classic car or whatever it is they're interested in, but they are less likely to open up and talk about their feelings and their struggles, particularly in a group environment. Men are more likely to open up one-to-one, but in a group environment, quite often, men find that more difficult. And that's because, well, we've got a whole session on men's mental health, and I could talk about it for hours, but I won't. But again, things are changing. If you look at teenagers and young men, their life experiences have very much more encouraged them to talk, and have taught them that it's okay to talk and it's okay to have feelings. But there is a demographic of men who were not brought up in that environment at all, and they were told to man up and suck it up and get on with it and be a man. And those things, when you're told that at a very young age, stick. So most suicides occur in a specific age group, and it's the same for men and women, and that's middle age. So if you think about it, there are a lot of additional pressures. Perhaps people start to think about their own mortality a little bit more. People tend to be the squeezed generation, so they might have aging parents whom they're having to look after, but they've also got perhaps children who are coming to their more challenging time of life, shall we say. They've got financial pressures. If people are thinking of going off to university, they're worried that their children aren't ever going to be able to afford a house. There's lots and lots of things that can get on top of them. And as we'll talk about in a minute, when people feel that there is no hope and that they can't manage what's getting on top of them, that's when it can lead to suicide. So if we look at the next slide, again, we run a whole session on suicide prevention. So it's very difficult to condense it into 1 or 2 slides, but very, very briefly, everybody, or not everybody, but many people assume that if somebody takes their own life or attempts to take their own life, it's because they're depressed and they're suffering from depression, and they will have been suffering from depression for some time. But actually, this recent Scandinavian research, I say recent, 2014, so it's been around a long time, but it's not very widely publicised. Though I got this research through the NHS. This research says that actually only between 2 and 4% of suicides are as a result of depression or another mental disorder. Much more commonly, I mean much more commonly, it's down to sudden trauma or bereavement, relationship breakdown, social isolation, lack of support, or some other short-term challenge. So personal conflict, bullying, discrimination, guilt, maybe their basic human needs aren't being met, such as shelter, food and warmth. So there is quite a high proportion of attempted suicide within the homeless community. One of the charities that CCC partners with actually is the Light Project in Peterborough. And we send a counsellor under normal circumstances in there once a week to work with homeless people who are really struggling. And that is a brilliant charity, the Light Project. It does a lot of work to get people back into work and back into housing. And the counselling that we provide is a very important part of building up people's self-esteem and their belief that they really can cope with life. The other reasons for suicide, quite often chronic pain, terminal diagnosis. If people believe that they're going to see out their days in a very painful and uncomfortable way, they would rather take control of that situation and end it themselves. Financial or social loss, if people feel ostracized or rejected by a group, or suddenly they just can't see their way out of debt and things are all getting on top of them. Or social vulnerability. There are so many reasons for suicide that it's very difficult to pin down in one short slide. But I think the main message here is that don't assume that somebody isn't vulnerable to suicide because you think they're not depressed and they haven't been signed off with depression. We all need to be very wary and look at the risk of suicide, because what suicide is about is a complete lack of hope and just not being able to see that things could ever get any better. So it's that hopelessness and the feeling that their only way out is to take their own life. But it can be a very temporary feeling. And if we look at these causes, many of them are very temporary things. And we sitting here, if we've got quite good mental health, are able to say that there are things that can be done about that. There are social services that can intervene. There are friends that can help with that. There's all kinds of things that we can help with. And as HR professionals, there are things that we can help with for people in our workplaces. So it's really helping people to see that there is hope. On the next slide, we've got just a few myths about suicide. And these are things that people quite often quote that are just not true. So people say, people who talk about it won't really do it. That's not true. Most people who attempt to take their own life have spoken to somebody, albeit a friend or in a professional capacity, about their intentions prior to actually doing it. So that is important. Secondly, anyone who attempts suicide must have a mental health condition. No, we've already talked about that. We've seen the research. It's not necessarily the case. Thirdly, if a person is determined to do it, nothing can stop them. There is an element in truth of this, because you can't be with a person 100% of the time, particularly if it's somebody in your workplace. And there are many things that you can do to support people and stop people taking their own lives in that instant. But people can change very quickly, within a minute, within an hour, within a day. And if you're only working with somebody, if you're only seeing somebody, for example, at work on a daily basis, if you're only working with someone as a counsellor on a weekly basis, it's quite possible that they leave you in a state where they do have some hope and they do feel that it is worth going on. But by the time 2 days later, they're sitting at home and they're pondering or dwelling on their situation, they lose that hope again. Another myth is that people attempt suicide because they can't or won't seek help. That is untrue. And most people who attempt to take their own lives have actually accessed a professional service, mostly a crisis line, within the last 6 months. So most people at some point will tell somebody that they are going to do it before they do it. The other big myth, and this is really, really important, is that mentioning the word suicide gives somebody the idea to do it. It's not true, and it's really important as part of assessing somebody's risk of attempting to take their own life that people ask the question. You don't actually have to use the word suicide. You could say, have you thought about taking your own life? Or it shouldn't sound like a suggestion, but is this something you've considered? Are you thinking about suicide? And it's really important because it gives that person permission to talk about it and gives that permission to offload. And 9 times out of 10, a person will just spill, and it gives them the impression that you understand what they're feeling. And that's a really important part of suicide prevention. Most people who experience the hopelessness before suicide feel so hopeless because they feel that nobody understands them and they feel that nobody wants to listen. So listening is a huge part of suicide prevention. So if we move on, why managers need to be trained in how to talk about suicide and mental health. It seems obvious, but I feel I ought to go through it. Managers do have a duty of care to all of their staff. And if they suspect that somebody is at risk, in the same way that as part of your safeguard training, if you suspected somebody was at risk, you would have a duty to address it or try to address it. The problem with managers not being trained when they start to initiate that conversation is that very often they don't understand where that duty of care ends and begins. And we get a lot of companies asking us to talk to their managers and train their managers, and we do a couple of workshops, because everybody's encouraged to talk. It's good to talk about your mental health. So people are talking more, and people are coming forward to HR managers and line managers at work and opening up and saying that they're struggling with their mental health. What's happening is the manager who receives that conversation doesn't know what to do with it, and doesn't know what they should and shouldn't be saying, and doesn't understand where their responsibility starts and ends. So you get some very traditional managers, or perhaps not so people focused, more task focused managers, who will have a little bit of a listen for a few minutes and then say, oh, right, well, sorry about that, go and see your doctor, and really just fob somebody off. And that's, if somebody opens up and has a bad experience when they open up, that can prevent them from opening up again in the future. So it's really important that when somebody does have the courage to come forward and admit what they're struggling with, that is received in the correct way. And I'm sure as HR managers or HR professionals, most people on this call will understand how to receive that call, but a lot of the line management who are very task focused and looking at the efficiency and the success of their departments may not have had the appropriate training to deal with that conversation. At the other end of the scale, we get managers who really don't understand where their responsibility ends and take it on as their personal project to check up on that person and try and get that person to do things and join things, and they want to accompany them to the GP, and really that's too much for a manager. It is a workplace, and whilst you have a responsibility to support that person and give them access to any additional help that they need, any professional services they need, any time off of work to access those services, and a responsibility to check up on them, it is not your responsibility to accompany them to the doctor and phone them every evening in your own personal time. And some managers really struggle with where that begins and ends. I've had calls in the evening from managers who said, oh, I've just had so-and-so on the phone and they're crying and upset and in crisis. As a manager, you need to know where to signpost that to, because you shouldn't be dealing with that. Another very important point is what I mentioned very briefly earlier about early intervention, because it can reduce the impact, both personally and on the business. So from a personal point of view, as with most things, if you've got a scab and it's infected and you get it, well, it's just very, very small. Dealing with that is a very minor problem, whereas if you leave it to give you septicemia, it's a much more in-depth and problematic recovery. And it's exactly the same with mental health. If you let things progress, and one mental health problem can often cause another one, so somebody who's dealing with depression can then start to experience anxiety, especially about returning to work. So it's really important that these things are caught and managed early, and we very much focus on trying to keep people in the workplace whilst making reasonable adjustments and giving them the support they need, because very often if they go off on sickness absence, you've kind of lost them, and it's it's more difficult to help them to recover personally and to get them back to work. And that has an impact on the business, both in cost and morale, and it can be quite demotivating for a manager who's trying to manage a serious mental health problem. So one of the things we do, and nobody understands what it is, it's called reflective practice for managers, but it's really looking at supporting managers on a one-to-one basis of people who, if a manager is dealing with someone who has a severe mental health issue or who is just exhibiting challenging behaviours, because quite often those people have personality disorders, then that's a service we can provide to help support those managers. It's really important that the person who is supporting also gets support. Another one is understanding their team member and their issues. I did say a very important part of this process is feeling understood, understanding if and how they can help within the company guidelines, ensuring company policy is adhered to, but it's really important that that message is delivered in the right way and that the language that's used sounds supportive, even if the message is delivering a negative message about where the support stops. And it's really important they don't make the situation worse. If somebody presents to their manager and says that they are considering suicide, it's very important to do a risk assessment, both from your liability point of view and to make sure that that doesn't result in a tragic end. Risk assessments can be flawed. There is no perfect science, but it's the best we've got at the moment, and that will lead you on to facilitating a personal safety plan, so that when somebody is in crisis, they have a plan, they have a list of people they can go to. If that's not available, where do they go next? They can assess how critical their situation is and take the right course of action depending on how bad they feel. And professional support. It's really important that people have access to some kind of professional support, like a counselling service, though other things are available. So on the next slide, we've just put some things, and this is what I was saying about not making it worse. These are actual quotes that people have said their managers said to them in a workshop when they presented and said, I'm struggling with my mental health, and you can decide for yourselves which you think might be helpful and which are unhelpful. You can also have a little bit of a think back, and perhaps in the early days of when mental health was just starting to come onto HR radar, and think, oh, maybe did I say something a bit like that? And maybe your intentions were good, but as we learn more about how to handle mental health issues, we realise actually some of the things we think might be helpful are not so helpful. So particularly where we learn that empathy is important, someone who says, oh, I know how you feel because I used to have depression, just go for a run, you feel better. Maybe that's not helpful, because that's not listening. That's not listening to how somebody feels. It's just wanting to tell them about how you felt. And some of them are just quite shocking. So I'll let you read those for yourself. But snap out of it, man up. In my day, we didn't have depression. We just got on with things. That came up more than once. So if we move on to the next slide, we can see that really the only helpful comment in that list is, what can I do to help? Do you want to talk about it? I'm here for you when you're ready. And the crucial point about that is, I'm here for you when you're ready. It implies that you're going to listen, not talk. And it's saying, I'm not going to force you to talk now, but when you're ready, I'm here. Just, come and find me. So I've put together some case studies of things that have come up with mental health with some of our clients, and the things that the practical steps we put in place to address what was going on. So this is a client of ours that's a large technical manufacturing company, a very particular demographic of workforce, a high level of absence, both for physical and mental health problems. And there had been a number of very traumatic incidents, both accidents and physical attacks with weapons on site. So you can imagine it was a hotbed and of conflict and stress, and there was a lot to deal with, as well as a real culture of them and us between staff and management. So we got a lot of referrals for counselling, and a lot of the counselling clients would report back to us about bullying and feeling like their managers were not on their team and they were just expendable and they were cannon fodder and all these kind of things. And we were called in to do something else other than just straightforward counselling when they'd had multiple suicide attempts in 1 year, and particularly in one specific business unit. So the first thing we did was critical incident counselling for anyone affected by any of these traumatic incidents. And that can include bereavement support, but obviously also with the traumatic attack. We also provided our basic 1-hour mental health awareness training for all staff, and they did it for every member of that business unit, and they made it compulsory. Because if what they'd found in the past is if they offered mental health training to these groups of men, they didn't turn up if they didn't make it mandatory. So everyone had to attend. We did workshops for their managers, suicide prevention workshops, more counselling, one-to-one on site, the reflective practice that we spoke about to support the managers who were the managers of the at-risk people. And then we made a recommendation of having either mental health first aid training for certain individuals or mental health champions. What we provide is not an accredited mental health first aid training, it's mental health awareness, and so we provide that to mental health champions who are there to do a very similar job, but they just haven't got the same certificate, but the course is pretty much the same content, but they're there as the first responders within the business. And mental health at first aid is very important. As I say, there are lots of other courses out there. I think Peter provides one with his organisation. They're just as good, but you don't get that little certificate and you don't pay a huge amount of money for these people to then try and sell you the opportunity to become a mental health first aider trainer. But they're usually a 2-day certified course, and they are then responders, as I say, on site for people to help in the first instance when people are in crisis. What is important to say at this stage, because I have approached organisations to offer counselling and they say to me, oh, we don't need counselling, we've got mental health first aiders. It is not the same. That's like saying, we don't need a GP, we've got a first aider. These people are there in the first instance to provide a first response service and then and patch up whatever do what they can to avert the crisis, but then they need to signpost on elsewhere. So some things will, like, physical first aid might be just mop it up and put a plaster on it, and that's fine. But other things, you'll need to call an ambulance or you'll need to tell somebody to go to their GP. And that is where mental health first aid is not your silver bullet. It's not an entire solution. It's just one tool in a kit of solutions as part of your mental health strategy. So your mental health first aider might have regular chats with someone who is struggling, and then if somebody's in crisis, might sit with them while they call the Samaritans, or they might have the process to refer them to counselling. And it's really important to consider who to appoint as mental health first aiders. A lot of people come forward because they have an interest in the subject, because they themselves have experienced mental health problems. As well-meaning and willing as they are not always the best people to put in that role. If someone is generally stable and is managing their mental health well, then that can be a very good thing because they can have empathy and they can understand. But if somebody is having an ongoing struggle with their mental health, it's not the person to put in that role. It's also important to provide refresher training, just as with your physical first aiders. You wouldn't do it once and then leave them for 10 years to get on with it. And support with the supporter is vital. Even our counsellors, our professional qualified counsellors, and we don't use any trainees, we only use fully qualified experienced counsellors. Even they have to have clinical supervision once a month with someone with the right qualifications, because it's so important when you're listening to difficult stuff day in, day out, that you have someone to talk to and explore how those things are affecting you and how that might be having an impact on your own personal mental health. And you need to give them somewhere to signpost to. someone like CCC who can provide professional counselling for anyone who needs it. You won't need it in every case, and your mental health first aiders will deal with a lot of stuff. But if there is that need, they need to have somewhere to go, because otherwise they're left feeling helpless and feeling like they've not done their job properly. And you need to make sure that confidentiality is maintained, and that you have an anonymous escalation process. So if somebody does need measures put in place to help them cope, that mental health first aider can go to someone in HR confidentially and know that action can be taken without everybody else knowing what's going on. And a process and resources for follow-up. As with any strategy, you need to review and see how successful it's been. So if we look at another case study, thank you. This is a different client, biomedical professionals, very stressful environment, very large organisation, but a really good proactive wellbeing programme in place. They already had an employee assistance programme for several years, but they also use CCC because a lot of EAPs will only provide telephone support. They won't deal with any complex cases. They will limit the number of sessions that you have. So we work with quite a lot of large organisations who already have an EAP. They deal with the run-of-the-mill stuff. And if anyone needs more support or a different kind of support or specialist support, then they come to CCC and use us. They also use us for their training. And so this organisation had high levels of absenteeism and the occasional crisis. And more importantly, a very high turnover of their mental health first aid volunteers, because the kinds of things that they were dealing with were starting to have an impact on those people. So again, we did refresher training and peer support, which is an annual session that we put in place. You can have it annually or 6 months with mental health first aiders to really give them the support they need and then encourage them and help them to be a peer support group going forward. And we just nip in every few months to make sure they're still on the right track. Again, mental health awareness training, but this time, because of the nature of the people, it was on a drop-in basis and it was very well attended. And then it's somewhere that I go about once every 2 months, and I stand in the canteen and just advise people about the services that are available and explain how to access them. And with this organisation, they're quite different to most of our clients because they just say anybody can call up at any time, and they don't have to go through HR, they don't have to go through a line manager, and that service is used quite extensively but not abused. And I think when we first put this self-referral system in place, though, the finance teams are a little bit concerned that it might be abused, but it's not. So I think people only access that service if they really need it. Again, we put a counsellor on site once a week because they have a large number of referrals there. So if we look quickly at change and how it affects mental health, again, we do a whole session on change and the impact in change and support through change. And I can't cover it in one slide, but just very quickly, these are some of the feelings that you can expect to go through when change is imposed upon you. And as we all know, how much consent you have and how much collaboration there is about the decision-making process of change is very key to how people to react to it. And they've got this nice little pathway that goes through as if you go through all these feelings one after the other. But in reality, as with grief, if you're going through any kind of emotional process, very often you don't go through it in this nice, neat little order. You go through it as your feelings dictate you need to. And sometimes you go back and you revisit those things, and different circumstances trigger a little bit reversal in going through the process. But ultimately, the hope is to get to acceptance and transition, and we help people deal with that. So I'm a bit conscious of time, so I've picked up the pace. The final case study was a publicly funded body going through an organisational restructure, and they already had counselling in place, but they were a bit concerned that while going through this process, large number of people would want to be presenting for counselling therapy, and obviously cost is key. So they wanted to see if we could put anything in place which might provide what most people need, and then only the people who really needed that additional support would report for a counselling referral. So we started with support through change workshops for managers, because as I said, how change is implemented is absolutely key, and how much consent and collaboration people have in that process is really key. And then we did drop-in sessions and group sessions for the affected staff. Now, what was interesting here is we were expecting people to come and talk about the change, the organisational change, and in the drop-in sessions, what we were seeing was actually people really wanted, that was just one of a change that was being imposed upon them at the time. So a lot of people were presenting with this squeezed generation that I was talking about before, with parents and child stress, and then the organisational change on top of that was the extra bit which made their cup overflow. So we did spend a lot of time with people talking about personal stuff, but if that's what they needed, and that keeps them on the straight and narrow, and that keeps them mentally healthy and not going off sick, that's achieved what it was intended to do. So just very quickly about COVID, because I know there was a different session on this that Peter did the other day. So are any of these scenarios familiar? Just some of the additional stresses and strains that we've seen presented over this time from some of our corporate clients. And their HR teams are talking to me about some of these things, particularly where people have had to impose pay cuts on some of their staff, because that does obviously cause motivational and performance issues. And a lot of conflict at a time when you'd think everybody should be pulling together and all facing the same enemy and having a common focus. There is a lot of conflict because people don't respond well when they're under pressure on the whole. So some of the things that have been imposed upon us in terms of change, I talked about the fear of furlough. Some people may fear furlough, other people may long for furlough, and then they are furloughed and the reality is slightly different to what they're imagining it would be. If people are furloughed for a long time, I know people who've been off for about 6 or 7 weeks now starting to have anxieties about going back to work. Even people who haven't been furloughed and been working from home, obviously there are concerns about going back into the workplace and the hygiene standards that will be there, the safety precautions that will be there. And I think it really is important to make sure you consult a professional, somebody like Peter, who can really advise you on the kinds of things you need to put in place, because not paying enough attention to those things now will have an impact on people's mental health going forward. So just to have a very quick mention about stress and anxiety. Stress and anxiety are natural, normal human conditions. They are essential to our survival, and we are evolved to manage them and deal with them in short bursts. Where the problem arises is where we're exposed to prolonged stress and prolonged pressures, because we're not designed to deal with that. And if we don't find time to wind down and relax, then we can have a build-up of negative feelings that can have psychological or physical effects. So the difference between stress and anxiety really is that stress comes from an actual situation or a perceived situation, but something that's happening to somebody now. Whereas anxiety is the fear of what might happen in the future. Sometimes these are broken down, the symptoms of anxiety and stress, because they present themselves very similarly. Sometimes they're broken down into cognitive and emotional as well, but I've just lumped them all into the physical symptoms and behavioural symptoms. And these are important for recognising when somebody in your team might be struggling, because we've already said that people might be reluctant to come forward and admit that's the case. So maybe if you start to recognise some of these symptoms either in yourself or in one of your colleagues, it's time to initiate a conversation. And I'm conscious these slides will be available, so I'm not going to read everything out. Self-help is key. It has never been more key than now. And we generally live by these 8 clangers at CCC, which have come from Dr. Philip Hammond, whom you may have seen on the TV. So clangers, just a little acronym to help you remember what you're supposed to be doing. Connecting people is key. Obviously, while we're in isolation, that's made more difficult, but we do have an article on our website, and in fact we have a load of self-help articles on our website, cambridgeshirecounselling.org.uk, and an article about how to preserve your mental health and keep mentally healthy during the COVID period, and things, you know, advice on how to make adjustments when you can't do your usual self-care routine. Learning is important, so if people are on furlough, they are still allowed to undertake training courses, and if they want to do that, that might be what they need to keep them mentally healthy, though we shouldn't put pressure on people to do that, because that again might be tipping them over the edge. Activity, I can't stress enough how closely physical health and mental health are linked. Poor health in one area will lead to poor health in the other. Again, could talk for an hour on that, but I won't. Noticing the world around you, so getting into nature and really connecting with the environment. That sounds very hippie, but anyone who went for a walk today will know how much better they felt when they came back, or especially if you've been at the seaside and staring at the sea, you'll probably have come back feeling really, really chilled. Giving back, it's really key to your mental health. Doing good for other people, paying it forward, it makes you feel good. And it's really important, even when we're struggling, that we feel valued and needed and necessary. Eating, again, physical health, mental health, so intrinsically linked. A healthy body does lead to a healthy mind. So we need to eat to nourish ourselves, even though when we are under stress, depression and anxiety, the temptation is to reach for the alcohol and reach for the chocolate and reach for the comfort food. That is not going to be what heals you. So you really have to moderate your diet. And relaxation is key. You have to find and schedule in, if necessary, put it in your diary, take time to relax and chill, because it's all about this prolonged stress. Remember, we said we can cope with it in short bursts, but if we don't have that downtime, that's when it starts to impact on our mental health. And sleep, I know this is easier said than done. Try to get 6 to 8 hours of good quality sleep, so you wake up feeling rested. Again, there is a sleep hygiene self-help article on our website, and lots of other resources on our website, so I'll hopefully put a link on here later on. Okay, yes I have. So, practical steps. What can we do as organisations during this period? It's really important to ensure regular and clear messaging. People will disappear if they feel that they're not being communicated with, and that's when you start to lose people mentally and you lose their buy-in for things you're doing. So you need to check in with staff more regularly, anybody who you've deemed to be at risk, but also people who you haven't deemed to be at risk, because sometimes you don't know. Remember, sometimes people haven't come forward and told you, so it's really important you check in with everyone. Just make sure that they know that they have somewhere to come if they need to. It's not about forcing people to tell you, it's about just opening that door and leaving it open. Ask how they're feeling, find out what's going on in their own personal lives. It might be that they've got kids running around them all the time while they're actually trying to do a Zoom call. And those are additional stressors that you need to be aware of as a line manager, because that can make somebody feel very anxious. Promote a supportive culture, circulate self-help advice, and above all, offer further support if required. And that's where CCC can help, obviously, and other organisations, not meant to do a sales pitch. And what can staff do? What can we all do to help ourselves? Be aware of your own mental health. Be responsible for your own mental health. One of the main reasons that we make every single person who comes to CCC pick up the phone and call us, or contact us via the internet, they have to take that first step to their own well-being, and it's really important that they are responsible for their own recovery. Follow the advice you're given. We all know we should eat better. We all know we should exercise. Do we do it? Not always. So follow the advice. If you're struggling, you know what will help you. Do it. Talk to someone who's sympathetic. And we all have our own networks and know who that is and who it isn't. But be honest about the problems. People tend to just brush off and say, oh yeah, it's just down to this isolation. If it's something else, be honest about what it is, because it will fester and it will grow if you don't address that issue. And again, ask for professional help if needed. We have a number of specialists in a number of areas, everything from transgender to autism to supporting people with those problems, to childhood sexual abuse. Whatever the problem is, there is bound to be someone out there who can help you. It's just about accessing that support. So please feel free to signpost any of your teams to CCC's website, cambridgeshirecounselling.org.uk, and if you go onto the individuals page, that's where you will find the self-help guides. So I've just summarised here, so you can screenshot it or whatever. It's a bit like my business card. If you do want to talk to me further, please get in contact and we can have a personal chat. If you're concerned about your own organisation and want to find out how we can help, happy to talk to you about that. There's my email address and my telephone number. Again, our website address, there's a contact us thing on there which will come to me if you go on the organisations tab. And those are the things that we can provide. Men's mental health workshop is just in the final stages of development. We are working with one of our clients because if there isn't the right solution for your organisation, what we can do is bespoke courses and bespoke help to suit whatever your needs are. So thank you very much for listening to me waffle. I know that it was very content heavy. Hopefully you've taken some of it in and hopefully it has been helpful. If anybody wants to contact me at any time, I'll be happy to talk to you about mental health in the workplace. Thank you.
Heather, what an absolute rock star. Absolutely awesome. Thank you so much. So yeah, big round of applause from me and from everyone else as well. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. We had a fantastic chat yesterday, didn't we, when we were getting set up for this? And we're so on the same page with, you know, when people come and ask for mental health training, it's like, right, okay, so what's the strategy? And it's all about this getting it, and I see in the chat's going off and everyone's totally agreeing with you. It's about having a bigger strategy. It's not just a sticky plaster of let's do some mental health training to fix things. It needs to be a wider organisational strategic approach that includes training, it includes awareness, it includes counselling where necessary, and all the other different strategies you've discussed. So yeah, thank you so much for that. And what a wonderful resource for us. I've seen one of the questions come up for you, Heather, and I know Nikki's going to hopefully monitor through there. I'm not going to say any names because we're recording this just in case of, you know, for any conflict there. But one of the questions I had was, do you only cover Cambridgeshire or will you cover a broader area, please, Heather?
Well, it's an interesting question. At the moment, most of our counsellors are within Cambridgeshire and surrounding counties. So we've got people in Northamptonshire, Lincolnshire, Rutland, just into Hertfordshire. We did have somebody in Bedfordshire, but she's just stopped counselling for us at the moment. However, if people have a need, if I have a conversation with an organisation and they have a need for regular counselling, we will find somebody in that area if that's what you need. Likewise, for the training and workshops, we travel. At the moment, all bets are off because all the counselling is remote. So at the moment, we are able to work with anybody via telephone or video link on a one-to-one basis, and also providing Zoom workshops and training. So not me, obviously, because I'm not technically minded, but yeah, so we can at the moment work with anybody anywhere, and going forward we will continue that option to make available remote counselling and remote webinars. But if it's a face-to-face solution that you want, obviously in the longer term, if it's just a few referrals, it will be needing to find where our counsellors are. As I said, we've got over 40 different counsellors, and they all have their own private practices. So they all generally work from wherever their private practice is, quite a lot in Peterborough, and otherwise dotted around the county. But get in touch with me. We'll see if we can help.
Thank you so much for Heather. That was really, thanks for covering that. Nikki, are there many more questions to cover?
Yes, bear with me. Hold on. Okay, so I've had a couple of questions, and again, no names, and it really kind of they're very similar in a sense of to the feedback on the chat around the strategy and the culture, and about adopting that culture that's really open and honest and transparent, and it's incorporating mental health in a sense of it's exactly the same as physical health, but that is definitely a culture change, which isn't as easy as some tick box objectives, quick, that's done. It's far more reaching. So I think they're definitely conversations kind of that we all can continue. But the two questions centered around how do you maintain confidentiality whilst making work adjustments for mental health? Because that can be quite difficult. But again, it's around, I suppose, really useful, but it's asking each individual what confidentiality they would like. Some people actually prefer others to know so that they can support them. So I suppose it's taking that up with the individual, and again promoting that through culture. But the other question, again, how do we encourage access to support if people are very resistant?
It's an age-old one. I mean, we've sent people in to do drop-in services and nobody has turned up, even though they had previously indicated that they wanted some help. And people will only come forward for help when they're ready. So I think it's very much about giving them lots of different options of how they can access that support, because it may be that if you've got a drop-in service on Tuesday, somebody isn't ready to present on Tuesday, but having also the opportunity for them to call if and when they need to, if and when they're ready, at any time at their convenience, just leaves that door open. And we are working with an organisation at the moment with exactly that problem, because they keep putting on lots of wellbeing initiatives, and their particular demographic of workforce doesn't want to be seen to be attending. So again, we're looking at doing something. It's a workforce which is not generally sitting at a PC. So we did talk about providing some webinar support for people, and some video counselling for people where they can go into a room and just access that kind of help. But it's really about giving people the opportunity to access support without people knowing that they're doing so, because quite often it's not about them not wanting to access it, it's about them not wanting other people to know that they're accessing it. We've had a lot of stuff, leaflets put on the backs of toilet doors, which was quite successful because people are in a cubicle on their own and they can just slip something into their shirt or whatever quite confidentially, or just having lots of messages. I think the organisation I work with, where I just go and stand in their canteen every couple of months, we always get 5 or 6 referrals in the few days following that visit, because they don't want to go to their HR team, they don't want to go to their mental health first aiders, perhaps some of them, they don't want to go to their wellbeing officer. But having me there, and this is where an external service is an advantage really, because we are very keen to promote the idea that anything that's said within a counselling session doesn't go back to anybody within that organisation. So we don't produce a report of what was said. All we would tell the organisation is this person turned up on this day, and they're progressing well with their sessions. So I think if you can reassure people of that confidentiality, that's really key to giving people the trust to present for the service and giving lots of different ways to access it.
Thank you so much for that, Heather. I think we've lost Nikki. Actually, she's kind of just frozen there. So I'll be honest. On the chat, there's a wonderful chat going on there. There's some other questions on there, but what I'd say is you're welcome. You're happy to accept any questions into your inbox, and your contact details are there, Heather.
Yeah.
So to save, because we're recording, and to save me sort of popping through and trying to find those, I can see there's some really great conversation amongst different people, and there's some wonderful professionals on this call today that I know are absolutely fantastic at what they do. So what I would say is it okay if we share the slides, Heather, on the group?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So what there's going to everyone who's attending, there's going to be a couple of opportunities to get involved in the conversation here. So very shortly after this meeting, we're going to share the slides on the community in both Facebook and on LinkedIn for all of the HR community. And then what I'll also do is, once this video's okay to go, I'll probably post that in the next couple of days as well, which will then give everyone an opportunity to join in again. We're having some great conversation around mental health strategy. So I really, really appreciate you doing that. I think as it's 8 o'clock, it is 8 o'clock. I think we'll probably tie things up.
I told you I could talk for hours.
No, not at all. And you are absolutely more than welcome. Whilst I've got everyone's attention, I just wanted to say thank you everyone for attending, firstly. Secondly, thank you so much, Heather, for giving us your time today and for joining us. It's been absolutely fantastic. And I look forward for us to extend our conversations moving forward. I know Nikki does quite a bit with you as well from a trustee point of view, but I think there's lots of collaboration opportunities and what have you. So fantastic. What I would say is, to everyone who's listening, HR Connect, we're really proud to have such fantastic people on here and joining the chat and joining the conversation too. Please do come along. We've got 2 more sessions this week on Friday, one in the morning with Katie. We're going to have a very informal coffee in the morning at 8:30 on Friday, and it's just going to be a bit of a catch up. We're really missing seeing everyone face to face each month. It's a real challenge. So we're going to have a catch up there, and then at 1 o'clock on Friday, lunchtime, Amy Polly's going to do a mindfulness session, which I'm really looking forward to. I think that's going to be absolutely fantastic. So we're really looking forward to those. So please stay engaged with the group. I'm going to indulge a little bit at the beginning. I didn't mention too much about what I do, but one of the things that I did want to mention, whilst we talk about free staff and mental health, I just wanted to shout out 2 podcasts I'm involved in. I co-host on a Stronger for Business podcast, which we have got a couple of sessions for mental health awareness. There's some really good ones on there about anxiety, and there's one released on Friday about resilience as well. They're totally free. Please do check those out. And then my own podcast as well, A Half Dozen Things. I interview Jem Hills, who's an ex 20 years Special Forces. I interview him on sort of mental health things and men's mental health too. So hopefully that would be really good. So check those out on Podbean. I'll put the links in the group too. Hopefully I've covered everything. Nikki, have I forgotten anything, or are we good to go?
No, I don't think we've covered. Apologies, I lost signal, so I had to kind of jump back on. Thank you so much, Heather. It's been absolutely fantastic. The comments have been amazing, which is really good. And I thought I knew quite a bit, but I've been scribbling notes and ideas.
You can have the slides.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And everybody attending, it's been lovely to catch up with you and go through the comments and stuff. And hopefully we'll see you on Friday.
Thanks very much.
Brilliant.